Let's see. It's preparing a live stream. It looks pretty good right now, Terry. We'll see.
Could you tell me what YouTube channel you're on so I can monitor comments on it?
It's going to be Sewer Parks Audubon's.
Got it.
Yeah, it's streaming. See, there you go.
Yep, got it.
I'm not sure what you mean. It's the Sewer Park Audubon Center YouTube page.
I see it, and I see it streaming.
Okay.
Great work, everyone.
Saved by Joey. As
Team.
usual. As
Classic,
usual.
as usual. Honest to goodness. Great job, everybody. T minus 6 minutes. I feel like SpaceX yesterday.
Did you watch?
I did not.
Did you see turkeys or just not have shots at them?
We saw turkeys in places where we couldn't shoot them, which is classic.
Smart turkeys.
That is pretty much the only place I ever see them, is where I can't shoot them. But we did spend some time on some phenomenal public land. We were over in Rutledge. No.
Hey, Terry,
Yes.
does everybody have hosting rights that needs them? Or do I send that to you to distribute?
Right now, nobody is, you're the only host and no one is co-host.
I will make you host and you can distribute that.
Thank you.
I spent some time in the phenomenal landscapes that you guys are all talking about, and it makes me want to move over there. It's wonderful.
So are you going to eat tofurkey then for Thanksgiving?
I still have a little bit of quail left, but yeah. I guess
I've had tofurkey and I wouldn't recommend it, but
yeah.
It's fun to say.
I've never found tofu that I like ever. Everyone's like, "Oh, you just need it in the right flavoring." No.
I don't think soy hunting opens till January.
Oh, touche. Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. All right, I'm gonna go on mute. Go team.
So, Joey,
Okay. Are we still in test mode? And you have to
we are still in test mode, but we are still broadcasting live to YouTube.
Yeah, I figured we should just let that stick. We can edit it out. We can edit.
Exactly. I think that's safer.
Because it may have something to do with the fact that we did pause it before, and I don't want to run that risk.
I know. I think so too. I think that's an issue when you pause or end or something like that. Well,
Are we going to start with this picture, Jen? So when Terry opens the webinar a minute early, we're already on the picture instead of the panelists?
Correct. And when you start talking, the picture will come down and your faces will be there.
Yeah, but I'll still say welcome everyone while we're waiting a minute.
Yes.
It's just that aren't we going to open the webinar? Oh, just about now?
Yep, we can do that. I'll
Pop up our picture and we'll start driving.
sounds great. Good luck, team.
Go team.
Jen, do you know about going off stage?
yeah, everybody should be aware that if you do not want your photo up, just turn your photo off and your mute on, and you will disappear from the view of participants.
I am getting an error that says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, let me make you the co-host.
Thank you. Do we also need to make Dave Showalter a co-host or no?
Yes, we do.
Just in case.
Okay, you should both currently be co-hosts.
And are you asking us to stop our video now until we get going?
No, you can keep your video on. Even once we're going, you really don't ever have to take your video off if you don't want to.
Okie doke.
All right.
We're ready for the PowerPoint first slide, the opening slide.
Yep, once Jen shares her screen, I'm going to start broadcasting and I'll count down for you. Everybody ready?
Yep.
Okay, 3, 2, oh, wait, no, pause. Everybody ready?
Yep.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, broadcasting.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We're just going to wait a minute while all the participants log into the webinar. We'll start the program in just a moment. All right, we're going to wait one more moment while we let people jump into the webinar and then we'll get started. Thanks everybody for your patience. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really grateful for such a fantastic turnout. My name is Deborah Jensen. I'm the Executive Director of Audubon, Washington. I started in April, just as the pandemic was closing in on Washington State. Our program today is going to tell the story of this beautiful landscape of the Sageland ecosystems, some about Audubon's work in this place. We'll hear some firsthand stories of the recent fires and share some ways that you can help as we move forward to try to restore and protect this beautiful place. We're lucky to have a remarkable group of speakers who've invested decades in the conservation of sage ecosystems and the species that are supported here. Let me introduce our speakers and then I'll turn it over to our leader. We're joined today by the Washington Department of Fish and Game Commissioner, Kim Thornburgh. Kim is a lifelong outdoorswoman and a retired public health physician. She's been a commissioner since 2015 and devoted an incredible amount of time to wildlife conservation as both a volunteer and with nonprofit organizations. We're also joined by Dave Showalter. He's joining us from his home in Colorado. Dave is a conservation photographer, has published 2 books, Sage Spirit and The American West: A Crossroads, and he's an award winner. And the award-winning Prairie Thunder, that book. Since 2015, Dave has worked with Audubon, Washington to document our Sagebrush Songbird Survey program and help tell the seldom heard story of Eastern Washington songbirds. We're also joined by Dr. Trina Bayard. Trina joined Washington Audubon in 2012. She's the director of our bird conservation program and has worked across the state to make sure the conservation focus is brought to bird conservation and make sure the birds are always at the conservation table. And finally, we're joined by Department of Fish and Wildlife grouse specialist, Dr. Mike Schroeder. He's worked on the biology and management of grouse since 1981 and is widely respected for his work on the greater sage grouse, the sharp-tailed grouse, and other species of sage-steppe wildlife. He lives in Bridgeport, Washington, which was in the midst of the fire in this recent months. So during the program, you can add questions to the Q&A and we'll handle them all at the end. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Commissioner Thornburgh. Kim, can you get us started?
Thanks, Deborah, and I'm so excited to be here as well. I have a few words to try and set the stage. I'm a woman of the West. I think that's why shrub step seems to flow in my veins. Our arid lands of the West, like the chaparral of my natal state of California and the sagebrush seas of the great Intermountain Basins where I now reside, are places of peace and tranquility for me. Many years ago, I was driving a Western Washington colleague from Omak to Spokane. As he peered out the car windows, he made frequent comments about the blandness, even sometimes I think saying ugliness, of the lands we were passing through. I remember thinking those adjectives were so contrary to my sense of the land, stunning, mutable, and oh, so fragile. Watching the land pass out a car window, it would be hard to know that the shrub steppe is so vibrant with life. All life needs water, yet these lands seem dry. What remarkable adaptations allow the plants and animals to survive and thrive. And the lands embody carefully crafted evolutionary balance. When I started birding, my commitment to the shrub steppe redoubled. Our world would be a sadder place if the dance of the prairie grasses disappeared from our springtimes and the chorus of the sparrows. My friend might have wondered about the attraction of drab little brown birds. I would suggest he open the windows and listen. On pre-dawn days at the Lex, I await the chorus to begin, at first softly, then crescendoing to its joyous symphonic welcoming of the day. The first sounds may be the gravelly coo of courting short-eared owls before they wrap up their nightlife. Then there's the rare tinkling bill of the horned lark, growing more frequent as savanna sparrows buzz in. Western meadowlarks begin with their croaky blackbird calls, soon claiming a shrub with their melodic song. Then come the vesper sparrow as courting snipes whir overhead or the long-billed curlew calls its name. As the Brewer Sparrow trills in and the sage thrasher adds its haunting mimicry, I wonder if they ever need a breath. I never want to lose this thrill. Our human footprint is huge. We break the balance that supports survival. My opportunities to contribute to shrub steppe conservation with Audubon, Washington, and my local chapter in Spokane give me hope. And I hope in the few hours between Omak and Spokane, my friend began to understand the awesome beauty. It will take all of us to ensure the West's arid lands endure. And now Dave Showalter will give us beautiful images of what I've tried to put in words. Dave?
Thank you, Commissioner Thornburgh. That was really beautiful. Those words of hope ring true. If the West is a mosaic, sagebrush is the fabric that holds it all together, supporting life for 350 species, including us. A functioning sagebrush ecosystem looks something like this, a vast expanse of unbroken, healthy sagebrush. There's something primeval about standing deep in glorious, treeless sage, engaging all of our senses as light traces from the mountaintops, bird song comes alive, the evocative smell of sage on the wind. Sorry about that transition. My Sage Spirit book was published by Braided River in 2015, and I met Audubon, Washington at the book launch event at Mountaineers in Seattle. Braided River is a part of Mountaineers. I'll come back to that in a bit. I spent parts of 6 years in the field to create the book, which is focused on the eastern half of the Sagebrush Sea. I was initially drawn to the sage because of the explosion of industrial scale energy development on the east side of the Rockies, fragmenting and destroying the sagebrush ecosystem. My research led me to Audubon Rockies. Audubon has the best science and the sagebrush ecosystem plan. Audubon Rockies would become friends and our lead partner on the book. I had yet to see a sage grouse until that day. And I've only missed one spring since, which was this year. These iconic noble birds with a remarkable courtship display are hardwired to sage, and all they really need is healthy sage to support life under the sage grouse umbrella. My focus was on the east side of the sagebrush ecosystem, if you can see my cursor, mostly Colorado and Wyoming. And here the sage grouse historic range is represented in that orange color, and their current range is that purple color. And then down below, the yellow represents the historic range of Gunnison sage grouse. And this big patch of blue is pretty much where all of the remaining birds are today. So Gunnison sage grouse are in pretty big trouble. If you're wondering where sage songbirds fit in, anywhere where there's healthy sage, that can support sagebrush songbirds. So I set out to photograph and witness wildlife richness and biodiversity, and pronghorn and western ungulates need freedom to roam. This ecosystem holds nearly all of the wild in the West, from sagebrush songbirds like this sage thrasher guarding his nest, to grizzly bears. And other lekking birds like Columbian sharp-tailed grouse, and the endangered Gunnison sage grouse with most of their leks on private lands. I'd like to think there's enough enduring wild to support both wolf and grouse. So what is our relationship to these lands and wildlife? Here, Tracy Johnson of the University of Wyoming holds a sage thrasher nestling while studying sagebrush songbirds in the Pinedale anticline gas field. I'm in awe of researchers who dedicate their career to single sagebrush species. Ranchers like Heather Sterling with her entire ranch under conservation easement, and 4 species of grouse plus nesting sandhill cranes are certainly doing their part. Sagebrush habitat fragmentation and loss in all its forms has major impacts on wildlife like mule deer, who need room to roam. And energy impacts people like Deb Thomas, who experienced a major well blowout upstream from her home and became an important voice for conservation. We need to measure all of these impacts and cite all development properly. There just isn't that much sage left. So switching gears to Eastern Washington. The Sagebrush Songbird Survey was a multi-year collaborative community science project to identify sagebrush songbird distributions within the remaining sagebrush areas of Washington state. And I was fortunate to go on tour with Audubon Washington in the spring of 2016 to experience the survey, witness sage grouse here with Mike Schroeder, and give presentations from Ellensburg to Spokane. Habitat loss looks different here. It's mostly agricultural conversion and fire. With incredible beauty and healthy sage in some of the survey sites that hold the drab songbirds with lovely songs like the Brewer Sparrow declining at 3% per year. And the spirit of the volunteers who put in thousands of hours is just so inspiring. And that's really why I wanted to shoot this story for Audubon, is for the volunteers who created a scientific body of data over time to be adopted into state management plans. It's joyful to hang out with dedicated folks like Steve Moore checking bluebird nest boxes while on our sage tour near Ellensburg. I kept pitching this story of community science and imperiled habitat to Audubon magazine and was given the assignment last year. Hats off to Christy Norman, who led the Sagebrush Songbird Survey from start to finish. Christy is in the summer 2019 article along with this sage thrasher in a beautiful big sagebrush. And this drone shot of community scientists working along the Columbia was key to the story. You are the reason I wanted to shoot and tell this story of volunteer work for science. Thank you to the extended Audubon science community for all the love you give to the enduring wild in the sage. So now I'm going to turn back to the Audubon's Director of Bird Conservation, Trina, who's here to talk about Audubon's work in this landscape.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for sharing such an incredible and beautiful body of work with us. We really appreciate your friendship and partnership in this work. Now, to get a sense of the magnitude of what we're talking about here, consider that much of the arid landscape of the Intermountain West was once dominated by a sea of sagebrush. All told, some 247 million acres across Western North America once supported this habitat type, including some 10.5 million acres here in Washington. As you've heard, these sagelands have supported important wildlife values and a surprising amount of biodiversity. Some 350 native species and 90 species of migratory birds rely on these areas for food and habitat. Sagelands are also part of our heritage here in the West. Native Americans rely on this landscape to maintain their cultural traditions and ways of life. Cattle ranching is certainly a deep-rooted part of Western livelihoods. And recreationists of all stripes look to this landscape as a source of adventure, rest, and renewal. Next slide, please. Here in Washington, we know that we've lost well over 60% of sagelands. This map, circa the 1990s, is the best available sort of snapshot of what that looks like. We know we've lost a lot more since this time. A lot of this habitat loss has been due to things like conversion to agriculture, to residential and urban development, to roads. And what remains is often degraded or fragmented. In recent years, we've also seen fire grow into a significant threat. And although fire is a natural part of this system, we're seeing an increased extent, severity, and frequency of fire associated with invasive cheatgrass, which is common to this landscape. Cheatgrass forms a carpet across the land that increases the risk of fire, and it has considerably less value for birds and cattle alike. Next slide. By now, many of you are familiar of the plight of the greater sage grouse, but many of our other sagebrush-associated species are at risk as well. Here in the state of Washington, close to half of our species of conservation concern are associated with sagebrush or shrub steppe areas, as well as grasslands, and that includes some 21 songbird species. Next slide, please. So Audubon's work is really aimed at helping this land do double duty. How can we provide both vital habitat for birds and healthy landscapes and natural resources for people? Here in Washington, we work with a variety of landowners, agencies, and conservation partners to protect the best remaining sagebrush habitat. As you've heard, in recent years, we've deployed hundreds of volunteers to strengthen the science foundation for the conservation of this habitat. And we're now poised to put this data to use in land use management and planning. And this is just one of the ways that we make sure we create a brighter future from some of our most vulnerable birds, but also preserving iconic landscapes and ways of life. Next slide. So Audubon, along with our partners and funders listed here, have invested an incredible amount in the conservation and the science and support of conservation of this landscape. in recent years, and I'm excited to share more about what we've been up to and what we've accomplished together. The Sagebrush Songbird Survey that Dave mentioned has been an amazing collaborative partnership that really has sought to figure out where the best places on the landscape are for the sagebrush birds that we care about. Next slide. Our study has focused on those sagebrush obligates, the species that really rely or are closely associated with sagebrush habitat. We also included grassland species that tend to occur in and around these areas. And these are what we consider our focal species. Next slide, please. Now, over the 6 years of this survey, we recruited and deployed hundreds of volunteers in support of this effort. Those volunteers came from 13 of our 25 Audubon chapters. They completed around 1,000 field surveys at 324 sites, resulting in over 20,000 records entered into eBird. eBird is a really important source of information for both scientists and the public, and this represents an incredible accomplishment. But it doesn't stop there. Next slide, please. Since our field studies were completed in 2019, Department of Fish and Wildlife scientists led by Dr. Matt Vanderhagen have taken this information and used it to assess the environmental conditions associated with species presence and absence, and use that information to create models that can predict their distribution across the landscape. I have a couple examples I'm excited to share with you today. Next slide, please. And again, these are courtesy of Dr. Vanderhagen at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Now, the first example I have here is for the sagebrush sparrow. Now, this is a bird that is quite reliant on sagebrush habitat. It's known to be pretty picky. It likes areas of really large, intact sagebrush habitat. And in fact, amongst sparrow species, it's known to have the largest known breeding territory size. And what this map is showing us is places where our data and models show that this species has a high probability of occurring. So the areas in red on the map show you where that high likelihood is. And just to get you a little oriented here, the largest block of red you see in the center of the map is around the Yakima Training Center. So this is a military lands that are used for military exercises and training. We also see some areas of red lighting up in and around Hanford, the Yakima Indian Reservation. And then as we move up north along that backbone there of the Moses Coulee into Grant and Douglas counties. Next slide, please. So this example is for the sage thrasher. So the sage thrasher is just an incredible songster. It's really well known for its long, complex, and melodic song. If you're ever out in sagebrush country, this bird is going to catch your attention. And in fact, early naturalists referred to it as the mountain mockingbird for its tendency to mimic other birds. Sure enough, later genetic analysis have shown that it's actually more closely related to mockingbirds than to thrashers. So here again, oriented towards the map, we see that Yakima Training Center area really lighting up. We see some expanded areas as we move up the Moses Coulee and the areas west of the Grand Coulee Dam and Banks Lake, even some areas lighting up into the Okanagan Valley up north. And then towards the east in the vicinity of the Swanson Lakes wildlife area. Next slide, please. My last example here is for the for the Brewer Sparrow. So this is one of the most abundant species in sagebrush habitat, both here in Washington and across its range. If you go in search of this bird, note that it has very subtle plumage. There's a reason that that people sometimes use the word drab or little brown bird associated with this bird. Roger Torrey Peterson once described their song as a chipping sparrow trying to sing like a canary. So I'll leave it to you birders to decide if you think you agree with that or not. You can see in this map a lot more areas opening up as showing a high probability of occurrence. So we see as we move up into the Okanagan Valley and Okanagan and Chelan counties, the Colville Indian Reservation, a lot of areas in the channeled scablands in the vicinity of Swanson Lakes. And we even see some areas showing up in the vicinity of the Blue Mountains in Walla Walla County. Next slide, please. So this information is just incredibly valuable. We can do things like overlay where all three birds are likely to occur. And you can imagine in a vast landscape such as this, having information that really helps us target our conservation and management priorities is really helpful. And so we can take information like this and overlay it with information about other ecosystem values and other human and social values, and use this to drive our conservation work forward. Next slide, please. And that's just what we're doing. These maps are being integrated into the state's priority habitats and species database. If you've never heard of that, you're not alone. It is in our state the legally recognized source of best available science for land use planning. So this is a place where local and county planners can go to access information about natural resource values. It's a place where members of the public can go to access that information and advocate for the protection of those values. And so it's just a very, very important and powerful place for this information to be housed. And so we are working with our local chapters to make sure that that information is being considered moving forward in land use planning, as well as other habitat management decisions across public and private lands. Now, quickly, a couple of the other issues that we're working on in this landscape have to do with solar siting and fire resilience and rehabilitation. Next slide, please. And with the passage of the Clean Energy Transformation Act last year, Washington state utilities must source 100% of their electricity from clean, renewable sources by 2045. Now, it's critical that Washington state balance the need to meet these energy goals, which we fully support and have worked hard to enact, to protect agricultural areas and wildlife habitat. So we're following the lead of our counterparts in California to ensure that the build out of solar energy in our state balances the need to transition to solar energy with the need to protect our agricultural heritage and wildlife values. So the first step is to secure funding to support a facilitated process where stakeholders such as Audubon and others can come together and have discussions about what that looks like on the landscape. Where are the areas of least conflict that we can direct our utility scale solar? Next slide, please. And finally, the issue of fire. Now, this is something we've been working on for a few years now. First, on the issue of rangeland fire response, how do we make sure that for landowners who live far from town or fire district facilities, that they can get quick and rapid response when fires do occur, to today's considerations about how do we, on the other side of fire, respond very quickly and get landscape rehabilitation going on the ground. What this map shows you is the areas in red are the areas that have burned in 2020. And what I hope you can see is in the dashed areas along the map, we have our sage grouse management units, the occupied ones showing in that dashed line, and the unoccupied areas in the solid black line. And what becomes very evident is that we have experienced a huge amount of fire in important areas for sage grouse and sharp-tailed grouse and our sagebrush songbirds this year. And so to learn more about what this means and how to proceed and how to respond, we've invited Dr. Mike Showalter, Dr. Mike Schroeder to join us to answer some questions about what he's seeing on the ground. So Mike, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
I am. Well, first of all, thanks for the introduction, and I really enjoy being here to talk about this. What I would like to do is to first sort of lay the groundwork for what you're seeing here. Around here, we have learned over the years to fear red flag warnings. A red flag warning for us usually means that there's going to be a lot of wind and a low humidity, and the fire risk is really high. So when they issue those sorts of warnings, it means basically don't go out and burn trash, don't shoot fireworks. There's a lot of things you need to be extra careful with on days like that. Well, Sunday, September 6th of this year was one of those days where we had one of the warnings. It was issued for the next day, which would happen to be Labor Day. And that's a particularly bad combination for us because people do like to have, be outdoors, have barbecues and other sorts of things. We don't think there's necessarily a relationship, but the reality is the night, Sunday night, somebody either on purpose or by accident, or who knows, it was just a fluke of fate, a fire started up near Omak. And that fire subsequently burned in a straight line, 50 miles roughly to the south. That 50 miles spread out as it burned, and we ended up losing somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 acres in one day. If you add the fire that burned at Swanson Lakes on the same day, we ended up with roughly 500,000 acres burning in one day. So what you're seeing here in this photo, this is from a hilltop overlooking what we always called the Mary Jane Hill Lek. A lek is basically a traditional display ground that sage grouse males will congregate on to display for females, and that's where most of the breeding occurs. And what you're seeing here in this picture on the upper left, that's actually taken on that same lek. You can kind of, if you look carefully, it's not the greatest picture, but those are five males that were actually displaying on that same lek. So this is actually kind of a typical way a lek like this might look. And that's the before, in essence, a before picture and an after picture. But what I wanted to mention about the scale of this fire is that a lot of people don't quite understand how, to give you an example, this fire burned a massive amount of area over a lot of areas that you might not think fires would be able to cross. Big fires are actually fairly common, are becoming more common across the West. Places like Nevada, Oregon, California, Idaho have experienced a lot of very big fires in areas that support sage grouse. Those are fairly unfragmented areas, continuous areas of sagebrush covering vast expanses of land, and they'll have 100, 200,000 acre fires, and that they cause a lot of damage. You can kind of understand how a fire could get going in a continuous landscape and not stop. This particular fire did something we didn't think was really possible in Washington because our area is so fragmented. It's fragmented with wheat fields. There's a big river. There's lots of roads because of all the agriculture. So we thought with the type of road system we had and all this, even though fragmentation has some negative consequences in the case of fire risk, we thought it might actually help us. That didn't happen in this particular case. When the fire burned 50 miles to the south, it was able to cross the Columbia River while hardly being slowed down. It crossed roads, it crossed grazed and ungrazed rangelands. It crossed wheat fields, not only wheat fields that had been recently harvested, but wheat fields that had been newly planted. The wind was blowing so fast that it was able to burn across those wheat fields with hardly any slowing at all. The bottom line is it happened extremely fast. And the result for sage grouse was that if you look at the occupied range of sage grouse in the state of Washington, those Labor Day fires burned approximately 50% of the sage grouse range. For sharp-tailed grouse, it was approximately 50% of the sharp-tailed grouse range. It set back our pygmy rabbit restoration efforts quite dramatically. And as Trina also mentioned, it had a pretty big effect on a lot of other sagebrush obligates as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's been really something to watch this from afar, and as someone who is a long-standing, a person who is both a resident and you've dedicated your career in this space, I can only imagine how challenging and difficult this has been. And I'm wondering, sort of in the aftermath of these fires, like where do we go from here?
Well, you can see me looking at my most optimistic point right here, because this was taken on the same hilltop you just looked at. I kind of mentioned what's been going on in other states, but if you go back and look at the last 20 years, I think if my memory serves me, roughly 2004 was one of the first papers that came out that was talking about the impacts of increasing fire frequency and extent on sage grouse and sage grouse habitats. Every year, it seems like there's a new paper that comes out that talks about how, well, it's still increasing. It's still increasing. And the fires we looked at in the early 2000s were big, and we were worried about them, but the fires in the 2010s were bigger, and the fires that we're now getting are even bigger. And there doesn't seem to be much of slowing of this process. And the result is that, like when we looked at past fires in Washington, we've certainly had fires, but you have to look at a lot of things that go into these fires. Not only is it the extent of the damage, the fire perimeter, but it's the fire intensity within the perimeter. A lot of these fires are burning so hot that you're not finding that it's damaging the roots of perennial grasses, which means that you don't get as much recovery following fire as you would if the fire were to burn at a slightly lower temperature. And this really matters when you have a big fire like this, because to get restoration, you have to have seed sources, whether it's a seed source left from an unburned fragment, or if it's the roots from a perennial grass or forb that can provide the nutrients necessary for the plant to recover and grow. And that, like, if you're looking at this picture right now, this is an area right behind Bridgeport that burned, and that as part of that same fire. If you were to go up there right now, and I go up there almost every day to go for a walk, this particular site has almost no restoration. There's almost nothing greening up, despite the fact that the fire burned 2.5 months ago and we've had plenty of rain. The reason for that slow recovery is the damage to the roots. There certainly are perennial grasses in there, but if the roots get damaged in these perennial grasses, they won't come back. And then if you look around these hillsides, there's hardly anything that wasn't burned, which means that seed sources are few and far between. And this is where we really get into trouble with fires of this size. This is why when we do have a fire like this that not only burns such a big area, but burns so hot, we get very concerned about not only how long it's going to be able to recover, but how much effort, energy, resources, time we're going to have to put into these areas to try to get certain, not only certain key species, things like sagebrush, an example, big sagebrush doesn't do a very good job of coming back after fire. It usually needs a seed source. Fortunately for sagebrush, though, the seeds are small. They tend to blow in the wind, and it's very good at dispersing seeds across big landscapes. But that only happens when you have sagebrush that is still present on the landscape. If it's not present on the landscape, you're either humans are going to have to get out there and collect seeds and distribute them, or something else is going to have to happen. Sometimes people will actually plant small sagebrush plants to try to get them restored. And sagebrush, as Trina's already talked about, is really important because it not only provides the nesting cover and nesting support for a lot of shrub steppe obligates, but in the case of sage grouse, it's their primary food source for half the year during the winter. That's how they got their name. They eat the leaves of sagebrush.
So Mike, if we walked away from this landscape and didn't do the rehabilitation and the seeding, can you sort of play out what this would look like in a few years if no action is taken?
Well, I suspect that just based on past experience and seeing other areas that have been a focus of big fires, we will get certain amounts of recovery, because this certainly isn't the first time these areas have burned, and I don't think it'll be the last time these areas have burned, so they do come back. However, without certain types of intervention, the really big fires, you tend to get some sorts of restoration with certain species. You may not have the sagebrush and other shrubs coming in as quick, which means you won't get the species that depend on those species back. You can also get certain invasive species which become more common. I think you already mentioned cheatgrass, for example. Cheatgrass can become more common because it does fairly well in these situations. It's an annual grass, and it tends to come back very quick. There's plenty of areas out there that actually do look green because they happen to have a lot of cheatgrass, and the cheatgrass came back after the fire. So in the last 2 months, a lot of the ones that have greened up the most are the ones where the cheatgrass was the most common.
Interesting. It's certainly overwhelming at times to grapple with both what has happened this year and the path forward. And, you know, again, as someone who is living and working in this landscape, I'd love for you to spend a little time talking about how and where you find hope.
Great question. Where I sometimes look for hope is in history. Going back and looking at these landscapes, knowing that the Native Americans made this their home, and fire was certainly a part of their landscape then. They learned how to deal with it, theoretically not on as dramatic a scale, but so they were at home here. 215 years, Meriwether Lewis was the first one to write about the greater sage grouse in this type of landscape. And when the Lewis and Clark expedition was in what's now southern Washington, they saw a lot of sage grouse. 104 years ago, William T. Hornaday also wrote about sage grouse, not in such a pleasant way. He basically issued a call to the people of the far west to save the sage grouse from complete annihilation. Those of you who don't know who William Hornaday was, he was a taxidermist who worked for the National Museum, which subsequently became the Smithsonian. He was also the first manager of what became the Bronx Zoo. So he had a long history of conservation concerns. Since then, if you take those bleak words of Hornaday and look at where we've come, we still have sage grouse. We still have the habitats that support sage grouse. One of the reasons we do is that people care about these landscapes, not only for their livelihoods, but it's a part of our culture. It's a part of our history. It's a part of our natural environment, basically part of our Western heritage, our way of life. And this picture right here illustrates to me where some of this hope comes from. Not the greatest picture of a Western skink, but it was taken at that same time, the same hilltop where I showed you the picture of the devastation overlooking what this spring was actually the largest display ground for sage grouse in the state of Washington. While looking at that bleak landscape and at that one single sagebrush plant at my feet, this little skink came out from underneath a rock and went running away. And the fact that something so small and seemingly delicate can survive that inferno and come out alive on the other end, to me suggests that Mother Nature is somewhat resilient. And as long as we give Mother Nature a chance to recover either the types of resources needed and seed sources needed, the encouragement, just sometimes standing back and letting things go without disturbance, whatever it is we need to do, I have to be confident that people will do whatever they can to provide that support.
Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I think point out, Kim.
I'm going to break in here because I've been watching questions come in. We have lots and lots of them, and they're all very interesting. So I'm going to actually start by answering one, and then that will be real quick. And that was, somebody was wondering about the document that you referred to, Trina, that is used in land use planning. And I'll just answer, it's called the Priority Habitats and Species document. It's developed by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and it is available on the web. It's an extremely valuable document to get familiar with. I've used it when I've commented on land use development, and in response, note that planners and others who are involved with land use development are quite familiar with it and honor it. So yeah, look it up on the web, Priority Species, Habitat and Species. So one of the first questions that came in someone wanted to know a little bit more about the pressures, the development pressures on shrub steppe, referring to agricultural development, but wondering also about the pressure of urban development. I think this is probably a question for Mike or Trina, because it refers really to the Washington type pressures. Pressure on development pressure on shrub steppe really varies throughout the range, but in Washington we see agriculture and urban development. So the question was about the pressure points. Where is development going on? Mike or Trina, do you want to take that question?
I'd be more than happy to address it. We, believe it or not, if you look at a lot of the rural areas of Washington, there actually are fewer people living out there in those remote areas than there were 100 years ago. But it's sort of one of these odd things. So even though there aren't the people out there there used to be, it's increasing now because people are starting to commute more. People are able to work at home more. This COVID situation is an example. There's more and more people finding they can work at home, and because they can do that, they like to live in really beautiful landscapes. So there's a lot more people who want to do that. We're not seeing the increase in development like cropland that we would have 80 years ago, but it's a big footprint in Washington already. Most places in the range of sage grouse and other areas of sagebrush don't have the type of development we have. Where we are seeing the development pressures, though, it's like I mentioned, more people wanting to commute, then the fact that there's energy issues, whether it's solar energy or wind power that people want to put in because there are initiatives to produce more green energy. And if green energy means solar and wind, they have to put it somewhere, and using, remote areas like Eastern Washington would come to mind. Other states like Wyoming have other pressures, oil, coal, that really dwarf our kind of the development pressures we've got, but they certainly are significant in parts of the range.
And Trina, do you want to add anything about a little bit more about the work that Audubon Washington is doing in terms of solar siting and ensuring that consideration of protecting this landscape is part of that siting?
Yeah, sure. You know, just like Kim, you mentioned in your story early on, a lot of people view Sagelands as sort of this empty or wasteland type environment. And so when they think about, you know, where they might want to put a large scale, utility scale solar, yeah, let's put it over there, right? Like, what else is that good for? And so part of our work is helping educate and connect people to this landscape to understand there is real value there. Again, not just for birds and wildlife, not just for cattle, but for people. If you've ever had the experience of being out in those areas at dawn, it is incredible. And so, you know, a lot of our work is how do we help move the conversation to a place where, yes, we all agree renewable energy is the way to go. And how do we do that in such a way that we really honor our other values across the landscape? And so, like I said, you know, a great example out of California has been the use of a facilitated process to bring together all the stakeholders, the energy developers, the ag, the conservationists, private landowners, businesses, et cetera, and really work it out. Where can we put solar in a way that we can all feel good about? And so that's the work that we are pursuing right now.
There was lots of interest in the maps that you showed. One question, why, since we know this development and conversion is going on, why don't we have more up-to-date maps on where it's happened? Why are we working with a 1990s map? And then a second question was, how were these maps developed? What was some of the data that went into the layers? Those are your bird maps.
Yep. So the first question is actually a great question for Mike. That's DFW maps. I can speak quickly to the bird maps, and then I'll punt it back to Mike. So those distribution maps, the things that went into those models are data on species presence and absence, and then a bunch of information about the environment, everything from the different types of shrubs and grasses growing there to the elevation, the topography. There's a whole list of environmental information that we use to, when I say we, I mean DFW, to build models that relate species occurrence to those conditions, and then they can predict that across the landscape. Does that answer the question?
I hope so. So thanks. Do you want to comment on why we haven't updated the extent of conversion at DFW? It's a difficult study, really. That was a pretty thorough study, and that kind of data is really difficult to collect. So do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the whole mapping process, it's a moving target. So what you tend to see with these maps, whether it's shrub step or the underlying crop layers or the underlying development layers, they're all moving targets. And it sounds like it would be kind of a simple thing, but it's not. As well as you have to consider some of these layers, there actually are restrictions on what you can and cannot use on a map. Conservation Reserve Program information, for example, we've had limitations based on privacy on to what we can use. So right off the bat, you're behind the curve on this. There have been restrictions on what we can use as far as power lines, because when you have businesses that are involved in certain things, there's certain types of things you're not allowed to use or put on a public map. I know it sounds crazy, but that's the way some of these things are. So there's a lot of things that are involved in this. And then this year illustrates another example of that. When you want to keep up to date on what's happening with the landscape, fires are happening every single year. And the reality is it takes a lot to keep up. But I totally agree that our maps need to be updated more than they currently are. And that's actually one of the priorities we have right now is to update some of our maps. So the question's right on target.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. So I think this next question you may want to start with. Can you talk a little bit about how grazing management might be addressed in these ecosystems and how it might contribute or detract?
Well, first of all, so a lot of these areas that support sage grouse do have livestock management, and I do firmly believe that if livestock management is done well, that you can that it can be compatible with a lot of the shrub steppe obligates, whether it's sage grouse, brewer sparrows, and even sagebrush sparrows. So you can do this. There are also but this is most of the livestock management that's happening is on private land, and the people. So one of the things that we have tried to work with are things like the Sage Grouse Initiative, which works with private landowners to try to improve management in a way that will not only benefit a livestock operation, but benefit species like sage grouse as well. And it's a voluntary program, but it does have money behind it so that they can do things like provide money for improved fencing, improved herd management so that they can move herds in and out of pastures to try to reduce what might be damage if the herd stays in one pasture for too long. So there are a lot of things going on there. That doesn't mean you cannot easily overgraze an area if you put too many cows in an area, and that doesn't benefit anybody. So and I'm not a range expert, so we do have people who are trained at this, who are much better at it, but clearly it can be compatible if it's done right.
Now, we've got so many questions that we're not going to get to. I see the time is running short, but this is an area also that I'll just mention Audubon works in. We call it working lands, matching agriculture with our wildlife. Just time for maybe short answers for a couple more. Questions about whether or not there's sagebrush reseeding projects going on in public lands and some of the other major landowners. Mike, do you want to answer that? Yes, you're saying yes.
So seeding I want to make sure I got this right. Seeding programs for
reseeding, particularly of sagebrush.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been it's a multi-part process. One of the first parts is figuring out which areas likely need a reseeding effort. And that is taking a look at, for example, fire intensity maps. So we've been taking the maps for these fires and looking at where they burn the hottest, most extensive, and where they're less likely to have a natural seed source close by. So that kind of helps you figure out where you need to focus your attention. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is trying to get a seed source that not only is locally adapted, but the type of plant that the birds show some interest in eating, and not all sagebrush is equal. So we've been actually thinking about, okay, where do we get a seed source that will produce the type of sagebrush, for example, we want, something that sage grouse like. And we're actually now coming up on the time to collect seeds, because the typical seed crop for a big sagebrush, for example, is starting to come on right around now, to where the seeds, where if you want to collect seeds, this is the time. And it's a little bit tricky to collect it because it's such small seeds. So you have to do it on a day when it's not really windy and hope that the wind hasn't already blown it all off, and collect the seed. And then you want to distribute it in such a way that you don't overplant an area. Sagebrush is actually really good at seeding. The seeds are really light and small, so you don't want to overseed an area. So there's a lot of tricks to it, and there's actually people out there who are really trained and good at doing this stuff.
So we're really short on time, but if people are worried about the grouse, can you just say that there has been some sage grouse survival, and we are considering how to get them through the winter? Just nod your head. That's
Yeah,
all we have time.
they did not all die. This fire took out the whole middle part of the range, but everything south of Highway 2, or almost everything south of Highway 2 survived. The things that are west, a lot of the western areas, southwestern parts of Douglas County survived, and the parts of the eastern part of Douglas County survived. So the birds are very mobile. Some of them did survive. We don't know what survival is. We're going to find out a lot next spring. So the birds they're still, a lot of them are still hanging on, and we'll find out next spring where they are.
Okay, that's all we have time for. I think that we're planning communication after we're done, and we'll try to get to some of the other questions. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dave for the final wrap up.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers and to our participants for helping tell the story of Washington's Sagelands today. If you'd like to learn more about Audubon's work in this endangered ecosystem, you can go to the Audubon Washington website or Google Audubon Washington Working Lands. Audubon Washington is hosting a virtual advocacy day on December 9, and we will be meeting with Eastern Washington legislatures in districts 3, 12, and 13. Find out if you live in a targeted district and sign up to participate by visiting our webpage, wa.audubon.org. If you're able to give, there is a collaborative effort underway to raise funds for 2020 fire restoration projects in Eastern Washington. Our friends at Pheasants Forever have created a webpage where you can donate dollars that will go directly for planting seeds, trees, and shrubs, removing fences, installing new fences, installing new watering facilities, and more. Efforts will be focused to have the greatest impact for local communities and wildlife. Audubon Washington will share all of these links in a follow-up email, including a recording of today's webinar. Please share widely so that more people come to know, love, and support this remarkable sagebrush ecosystem and the birds and other wildlife that are sustained by it. Thank you for joining us today.